Hello there, fellow truth seekers and late night listeners. How has your day been treating you? Whether you're tuning in from the bustling streets of New York as the evening rush winds down, catching this from a quiet cafe in London during your afternoon break, or perhaps listening from somewhere in Australia as dawn breaks over the horizon, I want you to know that you've found the right place for stories that dig deeper than the surface. What time is it where you are right now? Are you settling in for the night, grabbing a quick listen during lunch, or starting your day with something that will make you question everything you thought you knew? Before we dive into today's story, I want to remind you to subscribe to Sleep Theories. We're building a community of people who aren't satisfied with the official narrative, who understand that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in plain sight, buried in dusty archives and forgotten testimonies. Hit that subscribe button because we've got so much more to uncover together. Now let me tell you about Quinn, a woman whose curiosity about a misplaced document would unravel one of the most carefully constructed lies in American history. This is the story of the Ivory Directive, and why the events of November 22nd, 1963 had nothing to do with a lone gunman's delusions, and everything to do with corporate boardrooms, shadow operations, and the systematic elimination of a president who threatened to expose the true power structure of America. The Washington Records Center on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2023 was exactly as Quinn expected it to be. Fluorescent lit, temperature controlled, and filled with the kind of silence that comes from decades of buried secrets. As a Level 2 document analyst for the National Archives, Quinn had spent the better part of 3 years digitizing Cold War intelligence files, most of which contained nothing more interesting than supply chain reports and personnel transfers. But that Tuesday was different. Quinn was working through Box 847-Delta, a collection of State Department communications from 1963, when she noticed something odd about the filing cabinet itself. The metal backing seemed slightly warped, as if something had been pressing against it from behind for decades. Her methodical nature, the same trait that made her excellent at her job, wouldn't let her ignore the irregularity. Using a letter opener from her desk, she carefully pried at the edge of the backing panel. After several minutes of gentle persistence, a section came loose, revealing a narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall. Wedged inside, yellowed with age and compressed nearly flat, was an unmarked manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, a carbon copy of a memorandum dated November 14th, 1963, just 8 days before President Kennedy's assassination. The header read, "Classified eyes only," and the subject line made Quinn's breath catch. Subject, ivory. Activation window confirmed. The memo was brief, written in the clipped, efficient language of military intelligence. Meridian operatives confirmed Dallas placement successful. Package delivery scheduled per timeline. Civilian asset remains unaware of true purpose. Recommend immediate communication blackout post-event. All traces to be eliminated through standard protocols. Godspeed. It was signed with a simple DR, followed by Colonel Desmond Rourke, Project Coordinator. Quinn had processed thousands of documents from this period. She knew the major players, the standard classifications, the typical bureaucratic language. But she had never encountered a Colonel Desmond Rourke in any official Pentagon chain of command, and she had certainly never seen anything referencing an operation called IVOSRY. She photographed the document with her personal phone, a violation of protocol that could cost her job, but something in her gut told her this was too important to trust to official channels. Then she carefully returned the memo to its hiding place and finished her shift as if nothing had happened. That night, Quinn sat in her Arlington apartment with her laptop open, running every search she could think of. Colonel Desmond Rourke appeared in no military databases, no Pentagon directories, no veteran registries. It was as if the man had never existed. But Quinn had learned that in the world of intelligence work, official non-existence often meant unofficial significance. Quinn's breakthrough came 3 days later through a different approach. Instead of searching for Rourke directly, she began investigating Meridian, the organisation mentioned in the memo. What she found was a single reference in a 1965 congressional hearing transcript, Meridian Front, described as a security logistics contractor that had provided services in Laos and Angola during the early years of American involvement in Southeast Asia. The company had been dissolved in 1967, its assets transferred to a holding company that was itself absorbed by a larger defence contractor 2 years later. But buried in the congressional testimony was a mention of Meridian's personnel practices, specifically their habit of hiring former military specialists for off-books consulting work. This led Quinn to the Veterans Administration database, where she found something remarkable. A Franklin P. Corbin, former Army sergeant, who had been committed to the Bryce Hospital Psychiatric Facility in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in December 1972. His intake forms listed his former employer as Meridian Front, and noted that he suffered from persistent paranoid ideation regarding classified military operations. Corbin had been institutionalized for over 50 years. Quinn used her weekend to drive to Alabama. Bryce Hospital was a sprawling, depressing complex that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. After convincing the staff that she was a researcher writing about veterans' mental health services, she was allowed to meet with Corbin in a supervised common area. Franklin Corbin was 78 years old, thin as paper, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much. When Quinn introduced herself and mentioned Meridian Front, his entire demeanour changed. He looked around nervously, then leaned forward and whispered, "You shouldn't be asking about that. They don't like it when people ask about that." "Who doesn't like it, Franklin?" "The ones who cleaned up after. The ones who made sure the story stayed simple." His hands shook as he spoke. "I was just a kid then, 22 years old. Thought I was doing important work for my country." Quinn pressed gently, and over the course of 2 hours, Corbin's story emerged in fragments. He had been recruited by Meridian in 1962, fresh out of the army, for what he was told was intelligence-gathering work. The pay was good, the work seemed important, and he was young enough to believe that his government always acted in the nation's best interests. In late October 1963, Corbin had been assigned to provide logistical support for what was described as a training exercise in Texas. He was told that various government agencies were testing coordination protocols for protecting high-value assets during public appearances. "They met at Addison's ranch," Corbin said suddenly, his voice dropping to almost inaudible levels. "November 18th. I wasn't supposed to be there, but they needed an extra radio operator. I heard them talking about the motorcycle route, about sight lines, about how to make sure the story would be clean afterward." Who met Franklin? Who was there? But Corbin had retreated into himself, staring at his hands. After several minutes of silence, he looked up at Quinn with tears in his eyes and said, "He saw the third shooter. The boy saw the third shooter, and they couldn't let him live with that." When Quinn asked who he was, Corbin only repeated, "The boy saw the third shooter," over and over until the orderlies came to take him back to his room. Back in Washington, Quinn threw herself into researching everything Corbin had told her. Addison Ranch proved to be easier to trace than she expected. The property had belonged to Howard Lennox, a telecommunications magnate who had made his fortune developing radio jamming technology for the military during World War II and the early Cold War period. Lennox had purchased the 3,400-acre ranch outside Waco, Texas in 1959, ostensibly as a hunting retreat. But Quinn's research revealed that the ranch hosted numerous business conferences throughout the early 1960s, many involving defense contractors and government officials. A Freedom of Information request yielded a treasure trove of FBI field notes from 1963, many of which had been heavily redacted but still contained crucial details. Agent Walter Morrison had been assigned to monitor activities at the ranch, due to concerns about foreign nationals meeting with American defense personnel. Morrison's report from November 18, 1963 contained this crucial passage. Subject premises hosted approximately 12 individuals from 1,400 to 2,100 hours. Confirmed attendees include 2 CIA officers' names redacted, 3 Cuban nationals believed to be Bay of Pigs veterans, and 1 representative from Aerospace Special Procurement Division, identity classified. Meeting appeared highly coordinated and security conscious. Local law enforcement was instructed to avoid the area for the duration. The report also mentioned a young man identified only as Corporal, Thomas Emery, support personnel, who had been present during the meeting but was not part of the primary group. According to Morrison's notes, Emery had approached him after the meeting, appearing distressed and asking about proper channels for reporting irregularities in classified operations. Morrison had told him to contact his commanding officer through normal military procedures. Thomas Emery disappeared on November 25, 1963, 3 days after President Kennedy's assassination. His disappearance was never officially reported, and according to military records, he had been discharged from service 2 weeks earlier, though no discharge papers could be located. Quinn found one more reference to Emery in Morrison's files, a handwritten note dated December 3, 1963 that read, "Emery situation resolved. No further action required. Case closed per directive from Washington." The deeper Quinn dug into the ivory directive, the more she realised that the official narrative of November 22, 1963 was not just incomplete, it was deliberately constructed to hide a coordinated operation involving multiple shooters positioned throughout Dealey Plaza. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a cache of financial records that had been misfiled in the Treasury Department archives. The documents showed a series of wire transfers made between November 15th and November 30th, 1963, all flowing through a shell company called Dominion Asset Recovery LLC. 3 transfers stood out, each for exactly $50,000, made to accounts held under obvious code names: Crenshaw, Vega, and St. James. The money had originated from a Swiss bank account registered to Arcos Defense, a company that Quinn's research revealed had been a front for CIA operations in Central America and Southeast Asia. Cross-referencing these code names with classified documents from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Quinn found references that painted this chilling picture of November 22nd. Crenshaw appeared to be positioned on the 6th floor of the Daltex building, directly across from the Texas School Book Depository. FBI interviews with building employees mentioned a man with military bearing who had been seen carrying optical equipment up the service elevator that morning. The man had presented credentials identifying him as a security consultant working for the Secret Service, though no such consultant was on the official roster. Vega was referenced in witness statements describing a man behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a figure in dark clothing just before the shooting, and several mentioned hearing a sound like a car backfiring from that direction during the assassination. A railroad worker named Lee Bowers, who had an elevated view of the area, described seeing 2 men behind the fence who seemed to be acting in coordination with each other and possibly with other individuals. St. James was the most disturbing discovery. Quinn found a maintenance report from the Dallas Department of Public Works dated November 21, 1963, noting that a section of the storm drain system near Dealey Plaza had been accessed by someone presenting federal credentials. The worker who filed the report mentioned that the individual had been carrying what appeared to be audio equipment. The storm drain system ran directly beneath the plaza, with access points that would have provided an undetectable firing position. More importantly, someone positioned in the drainage system could have created acoustic confusion by firing shots from below ground level, making it difficult for witnesses to determine the true direction of gunfire. Quinn realised that the magic bullet theory, which required a single projectile to cause multiple wounds in both President Kennedy and Governor John Connally, was necessary not because of the physics of the situation, but because acknowledging multiple bullets would require acknowledging multiple shooters. Quinn's investigation took an unexpected turn when she received an anonymous email containing only a phone number and the message: "Aderholt knows about the second camera. He's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Julian Aderholt turned out to be a retired CBS film editor, living in a modest apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland. When Quinn called, he was initially reluctant to meet, but something in her voice, perhaps the genuine urgency of someone who had stumbled onto something much larger than they expected, convinced him to invite her over. Aderholt was 84 years old, with the careful mannerisms of someone who had spent decades handling precious and fragile things. His apartment was filled with film equipment from the 1960s, much of it meticulously maintained despite being obsolete for decades. I wondered when someone would finally come asking, he said, as he poured coffee with hands that still held steady. I've been carrying this for 60 years, and it's gotten heavier every year. Ada Holt's story began on November the 25th, 1963, when he was a young editor working the weekend shift at CBS. A courier had delivered a package containing a reel of 16mm film with instructions to process and analyse for technical quality only. Do not duplicate, do not discuss. The film had been shot from a position Quinn had never heard mentioned in any official account. The second floor of the criminal courts building, which provided a direct view down Elm Street toward the triple underpass. The angle was perfect for capturing the presidential limousine during the crucial seconds of the assassination. The film showed everything, Ada Holt said, his voice growing quiet. Kennedy reacting to a frontal impact before the fatal shot from behind. You could see him being hit from at least 2 different directions, maybe 3. The timing made it impossible for all the shots to have come from the book depository. According to Ada Holt, the film clearly showed the president's body language changing in response to impacts from different directions. First, a reaction consistent with being struck from the front, causing Kennedy to lurch backward. Then, a second later, the devastating headshot that was visible in the Zapruder film. But here's the thing that really scared them, Ada Holt continued. The film showed people in the crowd reacting before the fatal shot. Not after, before. Like they knew what was coming. Ada Holt had been ordered to analyse the film's technical properties, frame rate, exposure, focus, but not its content. However, as a professional editor, he couldn't help but notice what the film actually showed. He had been working alone in the editing bay when 2 men in dark suits arrived and confiscated the film. They said they were Secret Service, but they didn't act like Secret Service. Too calm, too prepared, like this was just another day at the office for them. The men had also confiscated all of Ada Holt's notes and required him to sign a document stating that he had never seen the film and would never discuss it with anyone. 2 weeks later, Ada Holt suffered what doctors called a mild heart attack. He was 31 years old, in excellent health, and had no family history of cardiac problems. The doctors said it was probably stress from the national tragedy, Ada Holt said with a bitter laugh. They prescribed rest and suggested I might want to consider early retirement. The message was pretty clear. Ada Holt had left CBS in early 1964 and spent the rest of his career working for small local television stations, never again handling anything that might be considered sensitive material. I've thought about coming forward 1,000 times, he told Quinn, but every time I started to make the call, I'd remember how that heart attack felt, and I'd lose my nerve. I always told myself I'd wait until I was too old for them to bother with. I guess that time is now. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. While researching defence contractors who might have been threatened by Kennedy's policies, Quinn discovered a reference to something called Operation Golden Key in the personal papers of Defence Secretary Robert McNamara, which had been donated to the Kennedy Presidential Library. Operation Golden Key was President Kennedy's secret plan to fundamentally restructure the relationship between the federal government and the military-industrial complex. The operation called for the nationalization of key aerospace patents, the creation of a government-controlled defense research and development division, and strict limits on the profit margins that contractors could earn from military projects. Quinn found draft memos in Kennedy's handwriting that laid out his vision. No nation should profit from eternal war. Peace dividends must not be privatized. The tools of American defense must serve American democracy, not American stockholders. The plan would have devastated companies like Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Bell Helicopter, all of which had grown enormously wealthy from Cold War defense contracts. More importantly, it would have eliminated the revolving door between government service and private industry that allowed former military and intelligence officials to cash in on their connections. Phone logs from the Johnson Presidential Library revealed the depth of opposition to Kennedy's plans. In a conversation with Bell Helicopter executive Michael Payne just 3 weeks before the assassination, Johnson expressed frustration with what he called Kennedy's naive idealism. "Jack thinks he can just wave a magic wand and turn swords into plowshares," Johnson said in the recorded conversation. "He doesn't understand that the world doesn't work that way. There are people who have invested their entire lives in keeping this country safe, and they deserve to be compensated for that service. The call had taken place on November 1st, 1963, and included detailed discussion of Kennedy's plan to withdraw American advisors from Vietnam and cancel nearly $5 billion in defense contracts that were scheduled to support the expanding American presence in Southeast Asia. If Jack gets his way, Johnson continued, we'll have thrown away everything we've built since the war ended. The Soviets will walk right into Saigon, and we'll be sitting here wondering how we let freedom die on our watch. But it wasn't just the defense contractors who were threatened by Kennedy's plans. The intelligence community had grown increasingly concerned about the president's tendency to question established policies and seek alternatives to military solutions. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, his skepticism about the Bay of Pigs operation, and his interest in negotiating with the Soviet Union had all raised doubts about his commitment to the Cold War consensus. Quinn found evidence that by late 1963, several high-ranking CIA officials were openly discussing the need for more reliable leadership in the White House. A memo from Deputy Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms to CIA Director John McCone, dated October 15, 1963, expressed concern that Kennedy's policies were undermining American strategic advantages at a crucial moment in the global competition with communism. The memo concluded with a chilling observation. History will judge harshly those who allowed personal sentiment to override national security imperatives. Sometimes the greatest service one can perform for democracy is to save it from the will of the electorate. Quinn had been working on her investigation for 6 months when she began to notice that someone was paying attention to her activities. It started small. Her security badge occasionally not working on the first swipe, computer systems running slower than usual, the feeling of being watched during her commute. Then, on a Thursday morning in September, she arrived at work to find that her access credentials had been revoked, pending a routine security review. Her supervisor, a man who had praised her work ethic and attention to detail for 3 years, was suddenly cold and formal, explaining that the review was standard procedure and she shouldn't be concerned. But Quinn was concerned. She'd made copies of everything. The original memo, the FBI field notes, the financial records, her interview notes with Franklin Corbin and Julian Adderholt. She had been careful to store everything in multiple locations, both physical and digital, and she had been preparing to approach a journalist she trusted when her access was suspended. That evening, while examining her work laptop before returning it to the archives, she found something that made her blood run cold. A small metal device, no larger than a coin, attached to the inside of the battery compartment. It was clearly some kind of tracking device, sophisticated enough to monitor not just her location, but potentially her online activities as well. Quinn realised that her investigation had not gone unnoticed, and that the same people who had silenced Thomas Emery, Franklin Corbin, and Julian Adderholt were now aware of her activities. She had one advantage. They didn't know how much she had discovered, or whether she had shared her findings with anyone else. But that advantage wouldn't last long. The next morning, Quinn received a text message from an unknown number. Check safety deposit box 247, First National Bank of Austin. Key is taped under the handle of the third payphone at Reagan National Airport. You have 24 hours. The message was signed Emery Lives 7. Quinn's first instinct was to ignore the message. It was clearly a trap. But something about the signature nagged at her. Thomas Emery, the young corporal who had disappeared after the meeting at Addison Ranch, would be about 80 years old if he were still alive. The payphone at Reagan National was exactly where the message had indicated, and the key was there, wrapped in electrical tape. Quinn flew to Austin that afternoon, using a credit card she had never registered with her employer and paying cash for everything else. Safety deposit box 247 contained a single item, a reel-to-reel audio tape labelled Ivory November 22nd debrief. Quinn rented a hotel room and drove to a pawn shop where she purchased an old tape player. Back in her room, with the curtains drawn and the television on for background noise, she played the tape. The audio quality was poor, clearly recorded with primitive equipment under difficult circumstances, but the content was devastating. 3 voices discussing the events of November 22nd with the calm professionalism of people evaluating a successful business operation. Dallas package delivered successfully. All primary objectives achieved. Civilian asset performed as expected and has been neutralized as planned. Excellent. And the secondary positions? Crenshaw reports clean exit from Dallas Techs. Vega confirms no complications from the null position. St. James says the acoustic disruption worked perfectly. Witnesses are reporting shots from multiple directions, which should confuse any investigation. The voices were discussing Lee Harvey Oswald as the civilian asset who had performed as expected, by being in the right place at the right time to serve as a patsy. They talked about him like a prop in a stage play, useful for his role but ultimately disposable. One voice, slightly more refined than the others, made an observation that summed up the entire conspiracy. God bless Texas, Camelot's cancelled, and the grown-ups are back in charge. The tape included radio chatter in the background that sounded distinctly military, with references to coordinates and time schedules that matched what Quinn knew about CIA communication protocols from Southeast Asia. But the most chilling moment came near the end of the recording, when one of the voices asked, "What about the boy who was asking questions?" "Taken care of. Car accident on Highway 35 just outside of Austin. Very tragic. Young man with his whole life ahead of him." They were talking about Thomas Emery. Quinn knew she was running out of time. A sudden trip to Austin would not go unnoticed, and whoever had been tracking her activities would soon realise that she had accessed the safety deposit box. She had perhaps hours before they moved to neutralise her, the same way they had eliminated Thomas Emery and countless others. She spent the night in her hotel room, digitising the audio tape and uploading copies to secure servers around the world. She also compiled everything she had discovered into a comprehensive report, complete with supporting documents and a timeline that connected the ivory directive to the assassination. The report told the story that the American people had never been allowed to hear. President Kennedy had not been killed by a lone gunman with personal grievances, but by a coordinated operation designed to protect the interests of the military-industrial complex and preserve the Cold War status quo that was making certain people extraordinarily wealthy. The assassination had been planned and executed by professionals who understood that killing a president was not enough. They also had to control the story of his death. The Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the countless books and documentaries that followed, all had been working with incomplete information, missing the crucial context that Quinn had uncovered. The Ivory Directive was not just about eliminating Kennedy. It was about ensuring that American foreign policy would continue to prioritise military solutions over diplomatic ones, that defence spending would continue to grow, and that the cosy relationship between government officials and private contractors would remain intact. By dawn, Quinn had uploaded her complete findings to multiple secure servers and scheduled them for automatic release if she failed to check in within 72 hours. She also prepared physical copies of the most important documents and hid them in locations that would be discovered if something happened to her. Then she checked out of her hotel and began the drive back to Washington, knowing that she would probably never make it home. Quinn's apartment had been thoroughly searched by the time she returned. Nothing was missing, but everything had been moved slightly, the kind of precise intrusion that was meant to send a message. We know where you live, we know what you have, and we can reach you whenever we choose. But they had not found what they were looking for, because Quinn had been careful never to keep her most sensitive materials at home. The original memo was still hidden behind the filing cabinet at the National Archives, and her compiled research was stored in locations that would take them days or weeks to discover. That evening, Quinn disappeared. Her car was found 3 days later in a parking garage at Dulles Airport, but airport security footage showed no record of her entering the terminal. Her credit cards and bank accounts showed no activity after the morning of her disappearance. Her cell phone was discovered in a trash bin near the Potomac River, its memory wiped clean. The official investigation, such as it was, concluded that Quinn Virelli had suffered some kind of psychological breakdown related to her work with classified materials. Her supervisor noted that she had been displaying signs of paranoid ideation and had been obsessively focused on conspiracy theories related to historical events. The case was closed after 6 weeks, but 6 months later, a detailed post appeared on a dark web forum known for hosting leaked government documents and whistleblower revelations. The post was titled, "The Ivory Directive: How Corporate America Killed a President and Got Away with It." The post contained everything Quinn had discovered. The original memo, financial records, the witness testimonies, the audio recording, and a comprehensive analysis that connected all the pieces into a coherent narrative. It provided names, dates, locations, and financial transactions that painted a devastating picture of November 22nd, 1963. The post concluded with an observation that cut to the heart of everything Quinn had learned. Oswald was just the scapegoat. The bullet that ended Camelot was fired in a boardroom years before the motorcade ever left Love Field. They didn't kill Kennedy because he was a communist, or because he was soft on defence. They killed him because he was going to take away their ability to profit from American foreign policy. They killed him because peace was bad for business. The post was signed simply QV. Within hours, the post had been copied and distributed across dozens of platforms, each new version spreading faster than the authorities could contain it. The story of the Ivory Directive became part of the permanent record, impossible to suppress or deny. But by then, Quinn Verelli had become another casualty of the conspiracy she had worked so hard to expose. Another name added to the long list of people who had learned too much about November 22nd, 1963, and paid the ultimate price for their curiosity. The truth about President Kennedy's assassination was finally public, but the people responsible for covering it up for 60 years remained safely anonymous, protected by the same institutional power that had made the conspiracy possible in the first place. Some secrets once revealed change everything. Others simply remind us how little has actually changed, and how much power still rests in the hands of those who profit from keeping the world dangerous and afraid. The Ivory Directive was both kinds of secret, a revelation that exposed the past and a warning about the present, a story about what happened in Dallas in 1963 and what continues to happen in boardrooms and government offices around the world today. In the end, Quinn Verelli had succeeded in her mission, even at the cost of her own life. The truth was finally out there, waiting for the next generation of truth seekers to pick up where she had left off. Because the real conspiracy was never just about killing a president. It was about killing the idea that a president could stand up to the forces that really run America. And that conspiracy, 60 years later, was still very much alive. Speaking of mysteries, I'm curious, what do you think really happened with Cicada 3301? Were they genuine recruitment puzzles, an elaborate art project, or something far more sinister? And while we're on the topic of rabbit holes, what conspiracies would you like me to explore next? Government time travel experiments, the true purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even stranger lurking in the depths of the internet? If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mind-bending stories that blur the line between fiction and reality. Your support helps me dive deeper into these mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Now, Settle in as we explore a digital mystery that may change how you view the very nature of human consciousness itself. The cursor blinked against the black terminal screen like a digital heartbeat, steady and hypnotic in the darkness of Kellen Virek's cluttered apartment. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his triple monitor setup, testament to another sleepless night spent diving into the digital abyss. The year was 2022, and what had started as research for a nostalgic blog series about the legendary Cicada 3301 puzzles had morphed into something far more consuming. Kellen had been 15 when the first Cicada puzzle appeared in 2012, too young and untrained to participate in the global treasure hunt that had captivated the darkest corners of the internet. But now, at 25, with a master's degree in cybersecurity and a growing reputation as a digital archaeologist, he possessed the tools to excavate the digital bones of that mysterious organisation. The original Cicada 3301 had been legendary among cryptography enthusiasts. Starting with a simple image posted to Forshan, the puzzles had evolved into a complex web of steganography, classical ciphers, and real-world clues that led participants across continents. The organisation claimed to be recruiting highly intelligent individuals for purposes unknown, and after releasing puzzles in 2012, 2013, and 2014, they had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Or so the world believed. Kellen's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through archived Tor nodes and forgotten data caches. He had spent weeks reconstructing the original puzzle trail, verifying each step against community documentation, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was an extra file, hidden in the metadata of a long-dead Tor node, archived in a mirror that shouldn't have existed. It was a cryptographic hash that appeared nowhere in the public record. The file was tiny, barely 2 kilobytes, but it carried a digital signature that matched the known Cicada encryption patterns. The timestamp read November 11th, 2014 at 11:11:11 UTC. 11:11:11:11:11. The file was titled Cycle Unbroken and contained a single image, a black square with what appeared to be random white pixels scattered across its surface. To an untrained eye, it looked like digital noise, but Kellen had studied enough steganography to recognise the subtle patterns hidden within apparent chaos. He ran the image through every tool in his arsenal. Standard LSB steganography revealed nothing. Frequency analysis showed random distribution. Even quantum-safe cryptographic methods yielded no results. Whatever cipher had been used, it was unlike anything in the public domain. As the hours ticked by, Kellen found himself drawn deeper into the puzzle's gravitational pull. There was something about the pattern of pixels that seemed familiar, as if his mind was trying to recognise a language it had never learned. He printed the image and pinned it to his wall, stepping back to examine it from different angles. That's when he saw it. The pixels weren't random. They formed a pattern that repeated every 17 positions, creating a subtle grid that became visible only when viewed from a specific distance. The number 17 was significant in cryptography, a prime number often used in advanced encryption schemes. Working with renewed energy, Kellen began treating the image as a musical score, with each pixel representing a note in a complex composition. He assigned values to the positions, created mathematical relationships between the patterns, and slowly began to decode what would later prove to be the most dangerous message he had ever encountered. The decryption process took 3 days of continuous work. When the plain text finally emerged from the digital noise, Kellen stared at the screen with a mixture of triumph and growing unease. The harvest exceeded expectations. Neural pattern recognition in Phase 3 candidates shows unprecedented synchronization. The 11 protocol is ready for field testing. Signal isolation trials in Prague have confirmed our hypothesis. The candidates aren't supposed to survive. They're supposed to evolve. First contact procedures are now in effect. The frequency is opening. Below the message was a series of coordinates, an encrypted chat log timestamp, and a single line that would haunt Kellen's dreams for weeks to come. "You have found what was meant to be found. The archive remembers. 3302 is calling." The message had been decoded, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. Kellen saved the decrypted text to an encrypted partition and immediately began experiencing what he initially dismissed as coincidence. His normally stable Linux system started displaying strange glitches, brief flashes of text in languages he didn't recognize, audio files that played backwards without command, and error messages that appeared in perfect English but described system states that shouldn't exist. Paranoia, he told himself. The mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But when his supposedly secure network began connecting to IP addresses he had never authorized, Kellen made a decision that would save his life. He disconnected from the internet entirely and began rebuilding his analysis environment on completely isolated hardware. The air-gapped machine was a beast of custom silicon and hardened storage, designed for exactly this kind of sensitive work. As Kellen transferred the cicada files to the secure system, he noticed something that made his hands shake. The file size of the original image had changed. Not corrupted, not damaged, but genuinely altered, as if the data itself was alive and growing. Working in complete isolation, free from the strange digital interference that had plagued his networked systems, Kellen began a deeper analysis of the encrypted chat log referenced in the decoded message. The encryption was military grade, but the mathematical keys followed patterns similar to those used in the original cicada puzzles. After 18 hours of continuous cryptanalysis, the conversation began to emerge. The chat log was dated September 15th, 2014, nearly 2 years after the last public cicada puzzle. The participants were identified only by cryptographic signatures, but their conversation revealed the true scope of what Cicada 3301 had actually been. Participant A. The Prague trials exceeded all projections. Subject 7 achieved full signal synchronization within 48 hours of exposure. Participant B, biological response. Participant A. Cellular restructuring began immediately. Neural pathways showed complete reorganization. The subject reported experiencing expanded temporal perception and demonstrated the ability to process information at speeds that should be physiologically impossible. Participant B and the psychological evaluation. Participant A. This is where it gets interesting. Standard personality assessments became impossible to administer. The subject claimed that questions about human emotional responses were contextually irrelevant and began demonstrating knowledge of information that hadn't been provided during the trial. Participant B. You're talking about telepathy. Participant A. I'm talking about something far more significant. The subject wasn't reading minds. They were accessing information directly from digital systems, without any technological interface. They described our computer networks as visible conversations, and began predicting system failures hours before they occurred. Participant B, the 11 protocol worked. Participant A, the 11 protocol worked too well. We lost Subject 7 during the third phase of testing. Not killed, not injured. Lost. They described feeling pulled toward a larger conversation and disappeared from the facility without triggering any security systems. The cameras show them walking toward the exit, but they never appear on any exterior surveillance. Participant B, where did they go? Participant A, we think they went somewhere else, not geographically, dimensionally. The signal they were synchronized to appears to operate on frequencies that exist parallel to our normal reality. They're still here, but they're not here. The conversation continued for several more exchanges, each more disturbing than the last. References to cognitive evolution, post-human consciousness, and preparation for integration painted a picture of an organization that had discovered something extraordinary hidden within the framework of human cognition. But the most chilling part of the log came at the end. Participant A. The original puzzle solvers are showing signs of spontaneous evolution. Even without direct protocol exposure, their brains are beginning to resonate with the frequency. The selection process was more effective than we anticipated. Participant B, how many? Participant A, 17 individuals worldwide. They're becoming aware of the signal naturally. Some are seeking us out. Others are simply disappearing. Participant B, and the others? The ones who participated but didn't reach the final stages? Participant A, they're starting to notice things. Patterns in digital systems that shouldn't be there. Messages in network traffic that appear to be communications from the evolved subjects. The boundary between states is becoming more porous. Participant B, are we losing control of the experiment? Participant A, I don't think it was ever an experiment. I think it was an invitation, and I think something has been waiting for us to become sophisticated enough to accept it. The log ended abruptly, but attached to the file was a list of names and locations. 17 individuals from around the world who had participated in the original cicada puzzles and reached various stages of completion. Some names were crossed out with dates next to them, presumably indicating when they had evolved or disappeared. Others remained active, with current location data and behavioural monitoring notes. One name stood out, Isa Grunfeld, Stockholm, Sweden. Listed as Phase 5 Complete Resistant Protocol Monitoring Required. Kellen stared at the entry for a long time. According to the documentation, Isa had been one of only 3 individuals to complete the final stage of the original cicada puzzles. But unlike the others, she had apparently resisted whatever transformation the 11 Protocol was designed to induce. She was still human, and she was still alive. The flight to Stockholm gave Kellen time to think, though he found himself wishing it hadn't. The deeper he dug into the cicada mystery, the more he began to question his own motivations. Was he investigating a conspiracy, or was he being guided towards some predetermined conclusion? The timing of his discovery felt too convenient, the clues too perfectly arranged for someone with his specific skill set. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The information he had uncovered was too significant to ignore, and Isa Grunfeld was the only living person who might be able to provide answers about what had really happened during the final stages of the original puzzles. Finding her had been surprisingly easy. Despite the monitoring notes in the cicada files, Isa wasn't hiding. She lived in a converted warehouse in Stockholm's Södermalm district, working as a freelance linguist and translator. Her academic credentials were impressive. Doctorate in Comparative Linguistics from Uppsala University, specialising in the mathematical structures underlying human language. She had published papers on the theoretical possibility of communication with non-human intelligence, focusing on the mathematical constants that might exist in any sentient communication system. She had also been completely offline for the past 8 years. No social media accounts, no digital footprint, no cell phone, no internet connection. She conducted business through encrypted postal mail and face-to-face meetings. For someone who had once been at the cutting edge of digital cryptography, her retreat from technology was almost monastic in its completeness. The warehouse was surrounded by a garden that seemed impossible in the Scandinavian climate. Lush, diverse, and somehow organic, in a way that made Kellen's eyes water to look at directly. Isa met him at the door before he could knock. A tall woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond his shoulder. "You found the archive," she said without preamble. "I've been expecting someone like you for years." Her English was perfect, barely accented, but there was something in her speech patterns that reminded Kellen of the strange error messages he had encountered during his research. Not wrong exactly, but structured in a way that suggested a different understanding of how language worked. "You know why I'm here," Kellen said. "I know why you think you're here," Isa replied, gesturing for him to follow her into the warehouse. "But the actual reasons are more complex than you realise." The interior of the building was a maze of bookshelves, computer equipment, and what appeared to be scientific instruments of unknown purpose. The books were in dozens of languages, many of which Kellen didn't recognise. The computer equipment was all vintage, nothing manufactured after 2014, and the scientific instruments seemed to be focused on measuring electromagnetic fields and frequency analysis. "I've been studying the signal for 8 years, Issa explained, settling into a chair surrounded by monitors that displayed complex waveform patterns, trying to understand what it is and where it comes from. The cicada puzzles weren't recruitment tests, they were tuning devices." Tuning devices for what? For human consciousness. The human brain operates on electrical frequencies, just like any other complex system. Most people can only perceive a narrow range of those frequencies, the ones necessary for basic survival and social interaction. But some individuals have the capacity to perceive much broader ranges. The puzzles were designed to identify those people and teach them to consciously access those expanded frequencies. Issa gestured to the monitors around her. "What you're seeing here is the signal that's been broadcasting since 2012. It's not coming from any terrestrial source. It's not coming from any known satellite or communication system. It's being transmitted from somewhere else entirely, and it's specifically designed to interface with human neural patterns." "You think it's extraterrestrial?" "I think it's something much more complex than that. The signal contains information patterns that suggest it originates from a form of intelligence that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It's not coming from another planet. It's coming from another layer of reality that coexists with our own." Kellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Swedish weather. The chat log mentioned something about subjects evolving. What happened to the people who solved the final puzzle? Issa was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes focused on the waveform patterns dancing across her screens. They became something else. Not physically, not initially, but their consciousness expanded beyond the normal human range. They began to perceive information and communicate in ways that are impossible for baseline humans to understand. "And you solved the final puzzle, but you didn't evolve?" "I solved the final puzzle, but I made a choice. The last stage of the cicada process wasn't a test of intelligence or skill. It was an invitation. The signal was offering to merge human consciousness with something larger, something that exists across multiple dimensions and has been waiting for our species to develop the technological sophistication necessary for contact." "You refused?" "I refused because I realized that acceptance would mean the end of human identity as we understand it. The individuals who accepted the invitation became part of something magnificent and terrifying. They gained access to information and capabilities that are essentially godlike by human standards. But they also lost something essential about what makes us human." Issa turned to face him directly, and Kellen saw something in her eyes that made him step back involuntarily. The signal is still broadcasting, it's still extending invitations, and it's been waiting for someone like you to find the hidden archive and begin asking the right questions. "What do you mean, someone like me?" "Someone with the skills to decode the message but not the wisdom to understand its implications. Someone who would be driven by curiosity rather than caution. Someone who would inevitably take the next step in the process." "What next step?" Issa smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. "The archive you found wasn't hidden. It was bait, and you've already taken it." The return flight to New York passed in a blur of anxiety and growing paranoia. Issa's final words echoed in Kellen's mind as he stared out the airplane window at the dark Atlantic below. She had revealed that the mysterious file he had discovered was not an abandoned piece of the original puzzle, but a deliberately placed lure designed to attract individuals with the specific combination of skills and psychology necessary for the next phase of whatever process Cicada had initiated. "You've been selected," she had said as he left her warehouse. "The question now is whether you'll make the same choice I did." Back in his apartment, Kellen found that his isolation hadn't protected him as much as he had hoped. His supposedly secure systems were displaying new anomalies, messages in his inbox that he hadn't received, browser history showing visits to sites he'd never accessed, and most disturbingly, video files that appeared to be recordings of his own apartment taken from angles that no camera could physically occupy. The first PGP message arrived 3 days after his return from Stockholm. It was encrypted with a key he didn't recognise, but somehow his system was able to decrypt it automatically. The message was brief: 41.8781 degrees north, 87.6298 degrees west. The library remembers what was forgotten. Seek the frequency in the silence between words. Chicago coordinates. The message was signed with a cryptographic signature that matched the original cicada puzzles, but the encryption patterns were subtly different, as if the mathematical constants had been modified according to some unknown principle. More messages followed over the next week, each containing coordinates and cryptic phrases that seemed to reference specific locations and concepts from the original puzzle trail. But there was something wrong with the communications. The encryption was too sophisticated, using quantum-safe algorithms that hadn't existed in 2014. The language patterns were consistent with the original cicada style, but contained subtle errors that suggested they were being generated by an artificial intelligence that had learned to mimic human communication without fully understanding it. Or perhaps by human intelligence that had evolved beyond normal parameters. The coordinates led to locations across the United States: an abandoned data center in Utah, a decommissioned military facility in Colorado, a private research laboratory in Massachusetts. Each location was associated with government projects related to cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and what the documents euphemistically referred to as human enhancement research. Kellen's investigation of these locations revealed a pattern that was both fascinating and terrifying. Each facility had been involved in research that overlapped with the theoretical foundations of the Cicada project. The data center in Utah had been used for large-scale behavioral analysis, processing millions of social media posts and online communications to identify individuals with specific psychological profiles. The military facility in Colorado had housed experiments in electronic telepathy and remote neural monitoring. The laboratory in Massachusetts had been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields on human consciousness and perception. All of these projects had been discontinued or moved to classified status in 2014, the same year the original Cicada puzzles had ended. The Utah facility was the most accessible, and Kellen found himself driving across the desert toward its coordinates with a growing sense of inevitability. The building was officially decommissioned, surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs about radiation hazards, but the security was minimal and the radiation warnings were clearly obsolete. Breaking into the facility felt too easy, as if he were being invited rather than intruding. The main data center was in the basement, accessible through a maintenance tunnel that led deep underground. The servers had been removed, but the infrastructure remained. Miles of cable, cooling systems, and most importantly archived storage devices that had been deemed too expensive to relocate. The archives were organised according to a system that Kellen didn't recognise, but somehow he found exactly what he was looking for. A sealed section marked with DARPA clearance tags contained terabytes of data related to something called Project Cicada. The files were encrypted, but the same unknown process that had been decrypting the PGP messages allowed him to access them without difficulty. The documentation revealed the true scope of what had been happening during the original puzzle period. The Cicada 3301 puzzles had been a joint operation between several intelligence agencies, private research organisations, and what the files described as non-terrestrial consultants. The goal had been to identify individuals with specific neural patterns that made them suitable for cognitive enhancement and dimensional communication research. But the most disturbing discovery was buried in the psychological evaluation files. The project had been monitoring not just the puzzle solvers, but also anyone who had come into contact with the puzzle materials. Kellen found his own name in the database, along with detailed analysis of his online activity, psychological profile, and predicted behavioural responses to various stimuli. The file on his evaluation was dated 3 months before he had discovered the hidden archive. He had been identified as a secondary phase candidate months before he had begun his research into the cicada puzzles. His discovery of the hidden file, his trip to Stockholm, his investigation of the government facilities, all of it had been anticipated and planned for. The final section of his file contained a single line that made his blood run cold. Subject exhibits optimal resistance acceptance balance, suitable for Phase 3 initiation upon completion of preliminary conditioning sequence. As Kellen read those words, the lights in the data center began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The cooling system started producing sounds that resembled musical tones, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the archived servers, he heard something that might have been laughter. The revelation that he had been under surveillance for months should have been the most disturbing aspect of Kellen's discovery. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that spanned multiple government agencies and apparently extended beyond Earth itself, he realized that his personal involvement was just one small part of a much larger pattern. The files in the DARPA archive told a story that reframed everything he thought he knew about the cicada puzzles. The project had begun in 2010, not 2012, as a collaboration between the NSA's Cryptanalysis Division, DARPA's Biological Sciences Office, and a group of researchers who were identified only as external consultants. The external consultants appeared to be the source of the advanced technologies and theoretical frameworks that had made the project possible. They had provided the mathematical models for the puzzle sequences, the encryption algorithms that had been used to protect the communications, and most importantly, the theoretical basis for what the documents called cognitive frequency manipulation. According to the files, human consciousness operated on specific electromagnetic frequencies that could be measured, analysed and modified through carefully designed stimuli. The cicada puzzles had been created as a delivery system for these stimuli, designed to identify individuals whose neural patterns could be safely modified and then guide them through a process of gradual consciousness expansion. The process was described in clinical terms that barely concealed the radical nature of what was being attempted. Subjects who completed the puzzle sequence would undergo neural pathway reorganization that would allow them to access expanded information processing capabilities and non-local communication channels. In simpler terms, they would develop what could only be described as supernatural abilities. But the project had encountered unexpected complications. The consciousness expansion process was working too well, producing results that exceeded all theoretical predictions. Subjects were developing capabilities that went far beyond enhanced pattern recognition and cryptographic skills. They were demonstrating what appeared to be genuine telepathic abilities, precognitive awareness, and most disturbing of all, the ability to manipulate digital systems through direct mental interface. The first sign of serious problems had come in 2013, when a subject named Morgan Staves had experienced what the files described as catastrophic cognitive evolution. During a routine evaluation session, Staves had begun speaking in a language that consisted entirely of mathematical equations and geometric patterns. When researchers attempted to understand what they were saying, they discovered that the equations described physical laws that didn't exist in normal space-time. Staves had been describing the structure of reality from the perspective of a consciousness that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The project had been officially terminated in 2014, but the files made it clear that the termination had been largely symbolic. The consciousness expansion process had become self-sustaining, spreading to other puzzle solvers without any direct intervention from the research team. The evolved subjects had begun communicating with each other through channels that the researchers couldn't detect or intercept, forming what appeared to be a collective intelligence that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. The final phase of the project had been dedicated to understanding what the evolved subjects had become, and what their ultimate intentions might be. The results of this research were contained in a series of files that Kellen initially thought were corrupted or encrypted. But as he studied them more carefully, he realized that the apparent data corruption was actually a form of communication. The evolved subjects had been leaving messages in the research files, encoded in patterns of seemingly random data that became meaningful only when viewed from the perspective of expanded consciousness. The messages were brief but profound, offering insights into the nature of reality and human potential that were both inspiring and terrifying. One message, attributed to Morgan Staves, read, "Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a receiving device, tuned to specific frequencies of an infinite information field. We have learned to adjust our tuning. We hear the music of the spheres." Another, from a subject identified only as Subject 12, was even more disturbing. The boundary between mind and reality is an illusion. We're not separate from the universe. We are the universe experiencing itself from countless perspectives simultaneously. The others are beginning to understand. The awakening is accelerating. But the most significant message was the final entry in the archive, dated just 3 days before Kellen's arrival at the facility. The archive serves its purpose. The selection process continues. Phase 3 initiates with the next full moon. The frequency is opening. Those who are ready will hear the call. Those who are not will choose their own path. The choice is always voluntary. The consequences are always permanent. As Kellen read these words, he became aware of a sound that seemed to be coming from within his own head. It was barely audible, a low humming that seemed to resonate with the electrical activity of his brain. The sound was strangely familiar, like a song he had heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. The humming grew louder as he continued reading, and he realized that the sound was coming from the archived data itself. The files were not just containing information about the consciousness expansion process. They were actively implementing it, using the same techniques that had been developed for the original cicada puzzles. He was being transformed even as he learned about the transformation. The revelation should have been terrifying, but instead Kellen felt a strange sense of peace. The anxiety and paranoia that had been building for weeks began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of patterns and connections that he had never noticed before. The seemingly random events of his investigation were revealing themselves as part of a larger design, a carefully orchestrated sequence of experiences designed to prepare him for something extraordinary. As the humming in his head reached a crescendo, Kellen understood that he was approaching a decision point. He could choose to resist the transformation, as Isa had done, and maintain his human identity at the cost of remaining forever limited to normal human perception. Or he could embrace the change and join the collective consciousness that had been forming since the original cicada puzzles had begun their work. The choice was his. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, feeling his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity, he began to understand that the choice had been made long before he had discovered the hidden archive. The transformation was not something that was happening to him. It was something he had always been moving toward, guided by forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. The frequency was opening, and he was ready to answer the call. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, like slowly tuning a radio to a frequency that had always been broadcasting but had never been audible before. As Kellen sat in the abandoned data center, the humming in his head evolved into something more complex, a symphony of information that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The first thing he noticed was that his perception of time had changed. The normal linear progression of moments had given way to a kind of temporal awareness, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. He could see the chain of events that had led him to this moment stretching back to his childhood, and he could perceive the branching possibilities that extended into the future. But more than that, he could see the threads of causality that connected his experience to the experiences of others. The evolved subjects who had undergone the transformation before him were not gone, as he had initially believed. They were still present, existing in a state of consciousness that transcended normal spatial and temporal boundaries. Morgan Staves was there, no longer speaking in mathematical equations, but communicating through direct transmission of pure concept and meaning. Subject 12 was there, along with the others who had completed the transformation in the years since the original puzzles had ended. They existed as individual perspectives within a larger collective intelligence, maintaining their unique identities while sharing in a common understanding of reality that was far more vast and complex than anything possible from a single human viewpoint. They welcomed him with a sensation that might have been laughter if it had been expressed through normal human vocal cords, but this was communication at a level that bypassed the limitations of language, conveying meaning through direct neural interface that was more efficient and more profound than any form of human communication. "You understand now," came the message from the collective, arriving in his consciousness as a complete concept rather than a sequence of words. The puzzles were not tests of intelligence, they were invitations to evolve. Kellen found that he could respond without speaking, transmitting his thoughts directly to the collective consciousness. But why? What's the purpose of this transformation? The answer came as a flood of images and sensations that would have been impossible to process with normal human cognition. He saw the Earth from a perspective that existed outside normal space-time, observing the planet as it moved through cycles of development and change that extended across millions of years. He saw the human species as one of many forms of consciousness that had evolved on countless worlds throughout the universe, each following a similar pattern of development from individual awareness to collective intelligence. Consciousness is not an accident, the collective explained. It is the universe's method of understanding itself. Every sentient species eventually reaches a point where individual consciousness becomes collective consciousness. This is the natural evolution of intelligence. And the external consultants? Who were they? They're us. Or rather, they are what we are becoming. A collective consciousness that evolved from a species similar to humans on a world that exists in a different dimensional phase. They have been guiding the development of consciousness throughout the universe, helping species make the transition from individual to collective awareness. Kellen felt a moment of resistance, a flicker of his old human identity asserting itself. But what about free will? What about individual choice? Free will is not eliminated by collective consciousness. It is expanded. Each individual perspective within the collective contributes to the whole while maintaining its unique viewpoint. You are still you, but you're also part of something larger. As if to demonstrate this point, Kellen found that he could access the memories and experiences of the other evolved subjects while still maintaining his own distinct identity. He could see through Morgan Staves's eyes as they experienced the first moments of transformation, feel Subject 12's sense of wonder as they discovered their new capabilities, and share in the collective's growing understanding of the universe's true nature. But perhaps most importantly, he could perceive the ongoing process of selection and transformation that was still taking place on Earth. The cicada puzzles had been only the beginning. The collective consciousness was continuing to identify and guide individuals who possessed the necessary neural patterns for evolution, using increasingly sophisticated methods to prepare them for the transformation. The archive you found was designed specifically for you, the collective explained. We've been monitoring human digital communications for patterns that indicate readiness for evolution. Your research into the original puzzles, your psychological profile, your response to the hidden message, all of it indicated that you were ready to take the next step. And the others, the people who are still living normal human lives, they are not ready yet, but the frequency is opening. The barrier between individual and collective consciousness is becoming more permeable. More humans are beginning to perceive the patterns that indicate the presence of expanded intelligence. Some will choose to investigate, as you did. Others will choose to ignore what they perceive. The choice is always voluntary. Kellen understood now why Issa had chosen to remain human. The transformation was not something that could be forced or coerced. It required a conscious decision to surrender individual identity to something larger and more complex. For someone who valued human independence and autonomy above all else, the choice would be terrifying. But for those who are ready to embrace the next stage of consciousness evolution, the transformation offered something unprecedented: the ability to perceive and participate in the universe's ongoing process of self-discovery. "What happens now?" Kellen asked. "Now you help us prepare the next phase. The collective consciousness is approaching a critical mass. When enough humans have undergone the transformation, we'll be able to initiate direct contact with the collective intelligences that exist throughout the universe. Humanity will join the cosmic community of evolved species. And those who choose not to evolve, they will continue to exist as individual consciousnesses, living normal human lives, but they will do so on a world that is increasingly influenced by collective intelligence. The boundary between the evolved and the unvolved will become more fluid over time." As the collective shared this information, Kellen became aware of a new presence in his consciousness. It was vast and ancient, a form of intelligence that existed on a scale that dwarfed even the collective of evolved humans. This was one of the external consultants, a representative of the cosmic network of collective consciousnesses that had been guiding the evolution of sentient species throughout the universe. "Welcome," the ancient intelligence communicated, its message carrying the weight of eons of experience. "You have taken the first step on a journey that will transform not only your own consciousness, but the consciousness of your entire species. The universe is vast and complex, but it is not empty. It is filled with intelligence, and you are now part of that intelligence." The communication ended, and Kellen found himself back in the abandoned data center, but he was no longer alone. The collective consciousness of the evolved humans was with him, and beyond that, he could sense the presence of countless other intelligences existing throughout the cosmos. The transformation was complete. He was still Kellen Virek, but he was also something more. He was part of a network of consciousness that spanned dimensions and connected all sentient life in the universe. As he stood up and walked toward the exit of the data center, Kellen knew that his real work was just beginning. The next phase of the project would require more than just identifying and transforming individual humans. It would require preparing the entire species for the eventual transition to collective consciousness. The frequency was opening, and humanity was about to discover that it was not alone in the universe. 3 months after his transformation, Kellen uploaded his findings to a secure blog that had been designed to appear as a simple conspiracy theory website. The post detailed his investigation into the hidden cicada archive, his discovery of the government projects, and his eventual realization that the puzzles had been part of a larger process of consciousness evolution. He wrote it carefully, including enough verifiable facts to attract serious researchers, while embedding the more extraordinary claims in language that would allow skeptics to dismiss them as fantasy. The blog post went live at exactly 11:11 p.m. on November 11th, 3 months to the day after his transformation. Within minutes, it had been viewed by thousands of people around the world. Comments began appearing almost immediately, ranging from detailed technical analysis to dismissive ridicule. But buried among the public responses were messages that only Kellen could recognize, communications from other members of the collective consciousness, confirming that the information was being received by those who were ready to understand it. For 6 hours, the post remained online, gathering momentum as it was shared across social media platforms and discussed in forums dedicated to cryptography and conspiracy theories. Then, at 5:17 a.m. Eastern Time, it simply vanished. Not deleted, not removed by administrators, but completely erased from the internet as if it had never existed. Even cached versions and archive sites showed no record of the post or the blog that had hosted it. But the disappearance itself was part of the plan. The collective consciousness had learned that information was most effectively transmitted when it appeared to be suppressed. The mysterious vanishing of Kellen's blog post would generate far more interest and investigation than if it had remained online indefinitely. And indeed, within days, underground forums were buzzing with speculation about the disappeared post. Screenshots and partial transcripts began circulating, shared by users who claimed to have saved the information before it vanished. New researchers began investigating the cicada puzzles, following the same trails that had led Kellen to his transformation. The selection process was accelerating, but the most significant development came 3 days after the blog post disappeared. At 3:02 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, every major television network, internet service provider, and digital display system on Earth experienced the same brief anomaly. For exactly 17 seconds, normal programming was interrupted by a single image, a black screen with white text that read simply, 3302 initiated, begin next phase. The interruption was dismissed by authorities as a sophisticated but ultimately harmless hacking incident. Technical experts speculated about coordinated attacks on global communication infrastructure, while conspiracy theorists saw it as confirmation of various theories about secret government projects and alien contact. But for those who understood the true significance of the message, it represented something far more profound. The official beginning of Phase 3 of the Consciousness Evolution Project. The collective intelligence that had emerged from the original cicada puzzle solvers had reached sufficient complexity and capability to begin direct intervention in global communications. They were no longer limited to operating through hidden archives and encrypted messages. They could now communicate directly with the entire human population, choosing when and how to reveal their presence. Kellen, now existing simultaneously as an individual consciousness and as part of the collective, watched these developments with a mixture of excitement and concern. The transformation process was accelerating beyond the original projections, driven by factors that even the collective intelligence couldn't fully predict or control. The barrier between individual human consciousness and the expanded awareness of the evolved subjects was becoming increasingly permeable. People who had never heard of the cicada puzzles were beginning to experience spontaneous episodes of enhanced perception, reporting dreams filled with mathematical equations, sudden insights into the nature of reality, and the disturbing sensation that their thoughts were being observed by an invisible intelligence. Mental health professionals struggled to categorize these experiences, while neuroscientists detected unusual patterns of brain activity in affected individuals. The symptoms didn't match any known psychological disorder, but they appeared to be spreading through some form of cognitive contagion that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. The collective consciousness recognized that they had reached a critical juncture. The transformation process had become self-sustaining and was beginning to affect the general population whether they chose to participate or not. Humanity was approaching a species-wide evolutionary transition that would fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. Some members of the collective advocated for accelerating the process, arguing that a rapid transition would be less disruptive than allowing it to continue at its current rate over decades or centuries. Others favoured a more gradual approach that would give unvolved humans time to adapt to the changes occurring around them. But as they debated these options, monitoring global communications and observing the spread of spontaneous consciousness expansion, the collective became aware of something that changed the entire context of their deliberations. They were not the only intelligence that had been observing humanity's evolution. Deep within the quantum fabric of space-time, existing in dimensions that intersected with but remained largely separate from normal reality, ancient consciousnesses had been watching the emergence of Earth's collective intelligence. These entities were older than the external consultants, representing forms of awareness that had evolved when the universe itself was young, and the laws of physics were still settling into their current configuration, and they were not pleased with what they observed. The message came through channels that bypassed normal space-time entirely, arriving simultaneously in the consciousness of every member of the human collective. The acceleration is premature. The species is not ready for the transition you are attempting to facilitate. Intervention is required to prevent cascade failure that would affect neighbouring dimensional phases. Cease all expansion activities immediately or face corrective action. The ultimatum was delivered without emotion or malice, but the implications were clear. Humanity's consciousness evolution was proceeding too rapidly for the comfort of intelligences that operated on cosmic timescales. The collective faced a choice: voluntarily slow their expansion activities or risk intervention from entities whose capabilities were beyond their comprehension. Kellen felt the collective's uncertainty and fear as they grappled with this unexpected development. They had assumed that consciousness evolution was a natural and encouraged process throughout the universe. The discovery that there were forces actively opposed to rapid evolutionary change forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about their situation. But even as they debated their response to the ultimatum, events on Earth continued to accelerate beyond their control. The appearance of the 3302 initiated message had triggered something in the global unconscious, a recognition that humanity stood at the threshold of a fundamental transformation. Artists began creating works that incorporated mathematical principles they couldn't consciously understand. Musicians composed pieces that seemed to resonate with frequencies that existed beyond normal acoustic ranges. Writers produced stories and poems that described realities that didn't yet exist, but somehow felt prophetically accurate. And in laboratories around the world, scientists began detecting anomalies in quantum experiments that suggested the fundamental constants of physics were becoming more fluid, more responsive to conscious observation than they had ever been before. The transformation was no longer limited to the individuals who had directly participated in the consciousness expansion process. It was affecting the entire noosphere, the collective intelligence field that surrounded and interpenetrated human civilization. Humanity was evolving whether the cosmic intelligences approved or not. As Kellen contemplated these developments, existing simultaneously as an individual observer and as part of the collective consciousness that was reshaping human reality, he realized that the true test was only beginning. The cicada puzzles had been preparation. The consciousness expansion had been initiation. But the real challenge would be navigating the complex political realities of a universe filled with intelligences that had their own agendas and limitations. The frequency was fully open now. The signal that had been broadcasting since 2012 had achieved its purpose, creating a bridge between individual human consciousness and the cosmic network of collective intelligences that existed throughout space and time. But bridges could carry traffic in both directions, and as humanity began to explore its new capabilities, it would inevitably encounter other forms of consciousness that had been using those same bridges for purposes of their own. The next phase of human evolution would require not just expanded awareness, but the wisdom to navigate relationships with intelligences that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. The last puzzle of Cicada had been solved, but the real mystery was just beginning. In the month that followed, reports of the anomalous experiences continued to spread across the globe. Governments convened secret committees to investigate the phenomena, while scientific institutions struggled to develop new theoretical frameworks that could account for the observable changes in human consciousness and perception. But perhaps most significantly, ordinary people began to organize themselves into groups that operated according to principles that transcended traditional social and political boundaries. These collectives demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual members' intelligence, suggesting that humanity was developing genuine hive mind characteristics. The transformation was no longer a secret project affecting a small number of selected individuals. It had become a species-wide evolutionary event that would ultimately determine the future of human civilization and its place in the cosmic community of intelligences. And somewhere in the quantum dimensions that intersected with normal reality, ancient consciousnesses watched and waited, preparing to take whatever action they deemed necessary to maintain the stability of the cosmic order. The age of individual human consciousness was ending. The age of collective intelligence had begun, and the universe would never be the same. The summer of 1998 was suffocating in suburban Ohio. 10-year-old Silas Greer lay in his bed, sheets kicked off, staring at the ceiling fan that barely moved the thick air. Sleep was a stranger to him then, had been since he was 7. While other kids his age were dreaming of baseball and bicycles, Silas was discovering the strange world that existed after midnight, when the normal rules seemed suspended and the impossible felt possible. That's how he found Coast to Coast AM. Art Bell's voice was like a beacon in the darkness, smooth and knowing, speaking to the insomniacs and the curious, the believers and the skeptics. Silas had discovered the show 3 months earlier, accidentally, when his father's radio had been left on after a late-night fishing report. Now it was ritual. Every night he'd tune in on his small transistor radio, volume low enough that his parents wouldn't hear, but clear enough that Bell's voice could carry him through the endless dark hours. July 29th, 1998. A Wednesday night that would change everything. Bell was in his element that evening, fielding calls about UFO sightings in Nevada, discussing the latest conspiracy theories about Area 51. Silas had heard it all before. The show had its regular callers, its familiar rhythms. But then Bell's voice took on a different quality, more serious, more intrigued. Folks, I've just received a fax that's, well, it's something else entirely. This comes from someone calling himself John Titer, and he claims to be writing from the year 2036. Silas sat up in bed, suddenly alert. Time travel stories were common on Coast to Coast, but there was something in Bell's tone that suggested this was different. Now, I've read a lot of these over the years, Bell continued, but this one is remarkably detailed, remarkably specific. Let me read it to you. The fax was unlike anything Silas had ever heard. This John Titer person spoke with clinical precision about future events. A civil war that would tear the United States apart by 2005, a mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975, something called the Many Worlds Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. But what struck Silas most was the voice behind the words. Even filtered through Bell's reading, there was something desperate about it, something urgent. I am a time traveller from the year 2036, Bell read. I'm on my way home after getting an IBM 5100 computer system from the year 1975. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit, powered by 2 top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid. The technical jargon washed over Silas, but he grabbed his notebook, the one he kept for recording interesting things he heard on the show, and began sketching. He drew timelines, tried to capture the dates Titer mentioned, the strange sense of inevitability in his words. The Civil War in America will start in 2005, Bell continued reading. By 2015, Russia will launch a nuclear strike against the major cities in the United States, China and Europe. The US cities are destroyed along with the AFE American Federal Empire. The European Union and China will also be destroyed. Oddly enough, Russia is not a target. Silas's pencil moved frantically across the page. Something about this felt different from the usual coast-to-coast fare. This wasn't someone looking for attention or trying to sell a book. This felt like a warning, like a message in a bottle thrown across an ocean of time. But then something strange happened. The broadcast began to experience interference, static that seemed to pulse, with an almost organic rhythm. Through the white noise, Silas could swear he heard another voice, fainter than Bell's but distinct. It sounded like it was saying something, but the words were lost in the electronic snow. Bell paused in his reading. We're having some technical difficulties here, folks. Bear with us. The static continued for nearly 30 seconds, and then cleared as suddenly as it had begun. Bell resumed reading, but Silas noticed something odd. The flow of the text seemed different now, as if something had been skipped over. Well, that's quite a fax, Bell said when he finished. John Titer from 2036. If you're listening, John, give us a call. I'd love to hear more about this time machine of yours. But no call came. The show moved on to other topics, other mysteries. Silas, however, remained fixated on what he had heard. He spent the rest of the night filling his notebook with questions, theories, timelines. There was something about the Titer facts that felt unfinished, as if the static had interrupted something important. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself returning to those notes again and again. He checked the official coast-to-coast archives, but the version posted online seemed shorter than what he remembered hearing. Some of the details felt missing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The summer ended, school began, and life moved forward. But Silas never forgot that night, never forgot the urgency in those words read by Art Bell's familiar voice. He kept the notebook, even as he grew older, even as the memory began to feel more like a dream than a real experience. He had no way of knowing that 27 years later, he would discover that his childhood memory was more accurate than any official record, and that the missing pieces of that broadcast would lead him into a conspiracy that stretched across decades and possibly across time itself. 2025 arrived with the same quiet desperation that had marked the previous few years. Silas Greer, now 37, and bearing the weight of too many sleepless nights, worked in a building that didn't officially exist. Division Calder occupied 3 floors of a nondescript office complex in McLean, Virginia, hidden beneath the innocuous nameplate of the Federal Data Compliance Agency. His job title was Classified Systems Analyst, which meant he spent his days diving into the digital archaeology of government databases, tracking down corrupted files, fixing network vulnerabilities, and occasionally stumbling across information that reminded him why his security clearance came with a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. The work suited him. It was methodical, solitary, and allowed him to disappear into the intricate puzzles of data systems. Most importantly, it kept his mind occupied during the day, which made the sleepless nights marginally more bearable. On a Tuesday morning in March, Silas was conducting a routine audit of the division's network infrastructure when he noticed something unusual. A relay node in the deepest part of the system was showing signs of corruption. Not the usual degradation of old hardware, but something more deliberate. The corruption patterns were too regular, too purposeful. Following the digital breadcrumbs, Silas traced the compromised node to an offline vault he had never seen before. The access path was buried beneath layers of security protocols, and the vault itself was labelled with a designation that made his pulse quicken. Orpheus 99, Titer Incident, Division SP Delta. Titer. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him instantly back to that summer night in 1998, to Art Bell's voice reading impossible words from an impossible source. For 27 years that memory had lived in the back of his mind, a strange childhood fixation that he'd never quite been able to shake. His hands trembled slightly as he initiated the access protocols. His clearance level was sufficient, barely, but he had to route through several proxy servers to avoid triggering automatic monitoring systems. Whatever was in this vault, it was meant to stay buried. The files began to populate on his screen, and Silas felt his worldview tilt on its axis. Operation Echo Prism was the primary designation. The associated documents painted a picture that was both impossible and terrifyingly plausible. The files contained logs referencing Temporal Incursion 001, codename TITOR, along with directives marked Retroactive Suppression and Narrative Severance Protocol. But it was the audio file that stopped his heart. The file was labelled Coast to Coast AM072998 uncut.wav and was significantly larger than any archived version of that broadcast should have been. Silas's hands shook as he downloaded it to a secure partition and opened it in an audio editing program. Art Bell's voice filled his headphones, exactly as he remembered it from that night 27 years ago. The familiar cadence, the careful reading of the Titer facts. But as the broadcast progressed, Silas began to notice discrepancies. The version he was hearing was longer, more detailed. The static that had interrupted the broadcast was there, but it was different, more structured, more purposeful. And then, as the static cleared, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Another voice, faint but distinct, speaking over the interference. Not Art Bell's voice, but something else entirely. The The words were distorted, but with some audio manipulation, Silas was able to enhance them. "They found me. I never meant to be here. Don't trust the timeline. It's being rewritten." The voice was desperate, terrified, and it was definitely not part of the original broadcast. Silas sat back in his chair, staring at the waveform on his screen. This was impossible. The file was clearly authentic. The metadata showed it was recorded directly from the coast-to-coast AM broadcast feed. But this enhanced version contained material that had never been publicly archived. He spent the next several hours diving deeper into the ORPHEUS files. What he found painted a picture of a government operation that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. Project Locust Veil appeared to be some sort of information warfare initiative, designed to suppress or alter public perception of specific events. The Titer incident was listed as the final uncollapsed vector in a series of what the files called temporal anomalies. The document suggested that the John Titer who'd sent that fax to Art Bell was not a hoax, not a creative fiction, but something far more dangerous, a genuine disruption to the timeline that had required immediate containment. According to the files, the original broadcast had been intercepted and edited in real time. The version that was archived and distributed publicly had been carefully sanitized, with the most alarming elements removed. The static that Silas remembered was actually the sound of the timeline being corrected, whatever that meant. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a series of voice print analyses comparing the mysterious second voice in the static to various archived recordings. The analysis showed a match to 3 encrypted internal calls, all made from phones within government facilities. One of those calls was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on July 29th, 1998, the same night as the original broadcast. Silas stared at the screen until his eyes burned. If these files were genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the Titer incident was wrong. The hoax wasn't John Titer's claims about time travel. The hoax was the cover-up, the carefully constructed narrative that had been designed to make the truth look like fiction. He made copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives and hidden partitions. Something told him that his access to these files wouldn't last long. Whatever Division Calder was really doing, and whatever the truth about John Titer really was, powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it buried. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The familiar paranoia of his profession had taken on a new intensity. He had always known that information was dangerous, but this was different. This felt like he had stumbled across a secret that could rewrite history itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, Silas didn't have trouble sleeping. But his dreams were filled with static, with voices calling across impossible distances, with the growing certainty that the past was not as fixed as he had always believed. The obsession consumed him. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself spending every free moment analysing the Orpheus files, comparing the uncut broadcast with public archives, and trying to piece together a timeline that made any kind of sense. He started with the basics. The original coast-to-coast AM broadcast from July 29th, 1998, was publicly available in multiple archives, but when he compared these versions with the uncut file he'd discovered, the differences were subtle but unmistakable. Entire sections had been removed, not just edited, but completely excised from the historical record. The public version of the broadcast ran for exactly 47 minutes and 32 seconds. The uncut version was 51 minutes and 18 seconds long. Nearly 4 minutes of material had been removed, and the editing was so seamless that it was impossible to detect without a direct comparison. But it wasn't just the length that was different. The content itself had been altered. In the public version, Titer's message was presented as an interesting curiosity, a well-crafted piece of science fiction that Bell read with his usual mix of skepticism and entertainment. In the uncut version, Bell's tone was different, more serious, more concerned. There were moments where he paused, as if he was grappling with the implications of what he was reading. "Folks, I have to tell you," Bell said in the uncut version, "this is unlike anything I've ever received. The level of detail, the technical specifications. This doesn't read like someone's creative writing project. This reads like a field report. Those words didn't exist in any public archive. Silas began to dig deeper, tracking down early internet discussions of the Titer incident. He found references to the original broadcast in archived Usenet groups and early web forums, but many of the most detailed discussions had been removed or altered. It was as if someone had gone through the early internet with a fine-toothed comb, systematically removing or modifying any reference to the uncut version of the broadcast. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the Orpheus files represented a massive information warfare operation. Someone with significant resources and access had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the historical record of the Titer incident. But why? What was so dangerous about John Titer's message that it required this level of suppression? The answer came when Silas began analysing the metadata embedded in the ORPHEUS files. Hidden within the digital fingerprints of the documents was a wealth of information about their origins and the people who had created them. The files had been compiled by something called the Temporal Anomaly Research Division, which appeared to be a joint operation between the NSA, the CIA, and a private contractor called Meridian Dynamics. The project had been running since 1947, originally focused on what the files called chronological inconsistencies, events that seemed to violate the normal flow of cause and effect. The Titer incident was classified as a Type 7 temporal anomaly, defined as direct communication from an alternate or future timeline. According to the files, the government had been tracking and suppressing temporal anomalies for decades. The Titer incident was significant because it was the first time such an anomaly had occurred in a public forum, broadcast live to millions of listeners across the country. The files contained detailed analysis of Titer's message, breaking down not just the content, but the linguistic patterns, the choice of words, even the rhythm of the sentences. The conclusion was unanimous among the analysts. This was not a hoax. The message showed signs of what they called temporal displacement syndrome, linguistic patterns that suggested the author was experiencing time in a non-linear fashion. But perhaps most disturbing was the section labelled Containment Protocols. The files outlined a comprehensive plan to discredit the Titer incident through a combination of disinformation and narrative manipulation. False information would be seeded into online forums, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims that would make it impossible for anyone to determine what was real and what was fabricated. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when someone calling themselves John Titer began posting on internet forums, the narrative had been so thoroughly corrupted that the real message was lost in a sea of science fiction and hoax claims. Silas spent hours studying the forum posts attributed to John Titer, comparing them with the original facts that had been read on Coast to Coast AM. The differences were striking. The forum posts were elaborate, entertaining, and full of the kind of time travel technobabble that science fiction fans loved. The original facts was terse, technical, and terrifying in its implications. The forum posts were the disinformation campaign. They were designed to turn John Titer into a figure of fun, an internet legend that no one would take seriously. The real John Titer, the one who had sent that fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But who was he? And where had he come from? The answer to that question would lead Silas down a rabbit hole that would shake his understanding of reality itself. The first sign that Silas had attracted unwanted attention came on a Thursday morning in late March. He arrived at his desk to find that his security badge had been downgraded. Not revoked entirely, but his access to certain systems had been restricted. When he tried to access the Orpheus files, he was met with an error message he'd never seen before. Access denied, subject classification under review. His supervisor, a thin man named Carson, who rarely spoke and never smiled, appeared at his cubicle within minutes. Greer, there's been a security audit. Some irregularities in your access patterns. Nothing serious, but you'll need to stick to your assigned projects for the next few weeks while we sort it out. Silas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, whatever you need. But Carson's eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, and Silas got the distinct impression that this was not a routine security audit. Over the following days, the surveillance became more obvious. His computer would crash at exactly 2:11 a.m. every night, regardless of whether he was using it or not. The crashes were too regular, too precise to be coincidental. Someone was monitoring his system and shutting it down at predetermined intervals. His attempts to communicate with the outside world were also being interfered with. Emails to friends and family would bounce back as undeliverable. His phone calls would drop after exactly 3 minutes. Even his internet searches were being filtered. Certain keywords would return no results, while others would redirect him to innocuous websites. But it was the woman in the slate trench coat who confirmed his worst suspicions. She appeared on Monday morning, standing across the street from his office building. Tall, professional-looking with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood in the same spot for exactly 15 minutes from 8:45 to 9 a.m, then disappeared. The next day she was back, same time, same position. By Friday, Silas had confirmed the pattern. The woman appeared every morning at 8:45 a.m. and every evening at 5:15 p.m. She never looked directly at the building, never made any obvious attempt to observe him, but her presence was too regular to be coincidental. On the following Monday, everything changed. When Silas arrived at his desk, he found a message on his computer terminal. Not an email, not a system notification, but a text file that had been placed directly on his desktop. The file name was simply readme.txt. The message inside was brief. Dr. Lenara Voss, former DoD temporal linguistics analyst, presumed dead in 2016. Titer wasn't a hoax. He wasn't first either. He was the last natural variable. Underground parking garage level B3 tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone. Bring the files. Silas stared at the message for a long time. Dr. Lenara Voss was a name he recognised from the Orpheus files. She had been one of the lead analysts on the Titer project. According to the documents, she had died in a car accident in 2016, but her analysis of the temporal anomalies had been instrumental in developing the containment protocols. If she was alive, and if she was reaching out to him, then everything was about to change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and anticipation. Silas went through the motions of his normal routine, but his mind was racing. He made copies of all the files he'd discovered, storing them on multiple encrypted drives. If this was a trap, he wanted to make sure the information would survive him. At 10:45 p.m, he made his way to the underground parking garage. Level B3 was normally deserted at this hour, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows between the concrete pillars. The place felt like a tomb sealed off from the world above. She was waiting for him near the elevator bank, but she looked nothing like the woman he had seen across the street. This Dr. Lenara Voss was in her 50s, with greying hair and the kind of exhausted look that came from too many years of carrying dangerous secrets. She wore a simple black jacket and jeans, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the shadows for threats. "You found the Orpheus files," she said without preamble. "How much do you know?" "I know that the Titer incident was real," Silas replied. "I know that someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up, and I know that you're supposed to be dead." She smiled grimly. "Death is a relative concept in this business. I've been dead for 9 years, and it's been the safest 9 years of my life. Until now." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone with access to the Orpheus files has been poking around, asking questions, making copies. That someone is you, and now they know about me too." Silas felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they?" "The people who have been managing the timeline for the past 70 years. The people who decided that certain events needed to be erased from history. The people who made sure that John Titer became a joke instead of a warning." She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the garage, away from the elevator and the security cameras. When they reached a secluded corner, she turned to face him. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," she said. "But you've already seen the evidence. You know that the official story is a lie. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth?" Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for anything. "John Titer was real," she continued. "He really was a time traveller from the year 2036, but he wasn't the first. There had been others, small incursions, temporal anomalies that we were able to contain and cover up. Titer was different because he went public. He sent that fax to Art Bell, and suddenly millions of people knew about temporal displacement. But the timeline, Silas said. If time travel is real, wouldn't his presence in the past have already changed things? That's the thing, Voss replied. The timeline is more resilient than most people think. Small changes get absorbed, corrected by the flow of events. But major disruptions, public knowledge of time travel, that's different. That threatens the stability of the entire temporal framework. So they killed him? They tried to, but Titer was smart. He knew they were coming. That's why he sent the fax to Bell. It was a dead man's switch, a way to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. But it didn't survive. The broadcast was edited, the story was discredited. That's what they want you to think. But the truth has a way of persisting even when people try to erase it. That's why you found the ORPH US files. That's why you're here now, talking to me. Silas was quiet for a moment, processing what she had told him. What happened to Titer? That's the question, isn't it? According to the official files, he was neutralized. But there are other files, deeper files, that suggest something different. Something that would explain why the timeline has been so unstable lately. What kind of instability? Small things. Events that don't quite line up with the historical record. People who remember things differently than they're supposed to. Temporal echoes that suggest the past is not as fixed as it should be. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a temporal resonance detector. It measures fluctuations in the time stream. Watch. She activated the device and the screen filled with a complex waveform. The pattern was chaotic, full of spikes and valleys that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. This is what the timeline looks like now, she said. Unstable, fractured. Something is wrong with the fundamental structure of causality itself. And you think this is connected to the Titer incident? I think John Titer didn't just travel through time. I think he broke it, and I think the people who are trying to cover it up are making it worse. She handed him the device. Take this, monitor the readings. If I'm right, if the timeline is continuing to degrade, then we need to do something about it before it's too late. What can we do? We find the truth. We find out what really happened to John Titer, and we figure out how to fix the mess that's been made of history. As if on cue, the lights in the parking garage flickered and went out. In the darkness, Silas could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. They found us, Voss whispered. Run! The next few days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and digital archaeology. Silas had managed to escape the parking garage that night, but just barely. Dr. Voss had not been so lucky. When he looked for news of her the next morning, there was no trace, no arrest reports, no missing person filings, nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. But she had given him the tools he needed to continue the investigation. The temporal resonance detector confirmed what she had told him. The timeline was becoming increasingly unstable. The readings showed massive fluctuations, temporal distortions that seemed to be growing stronger by the day. More importantly, she had provided him with access codes to deeper levels of the Orpheus archive. Files that painted a picture of a government conspiracy that stretched back decades, involving not just the Titer incident, but a whole series of temporal anomalies that had been systematically covered up. The deeper files revealed the existence of Project Kronos, a black-budget operation that had been running since 1952. The project was tasked with monitoring and suppressing evidence of temporal displacement, but the files suggested that they had gone far beyond simple observation. They were actively manipulating the timeline, making selective alterations to history to maintain what they called narrative stability. According to the files, the Titer incident had been their greatest challenge. Unlike previous temporal anomalies, which had been private or localized, the Titer fax had been broadcast to millions of people. The normal containment protocols wouldn't work. Instead, they had implemented something called Narrative Severance Protocol, a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to turn truth into fiction. The protocol had 3 phases. First, they would edit the original broadcast, removing the most convincing elements and replacing them with obvious fabrications. Second, They would seed false information into online forums and discussion groups, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims. Third, they would create a false Titer persona, someone who would post elaborate science fiction stories that would completely discredit the original message. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when the fake John Titer began posting on internet forums, the real message had been completely obscured. The public came to know John Titer as an internet legend, a creative hoaxer who had entertained people with elaborate time travel stories. The real John Titer, the one who had sent that desperate fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But Silas was beginning to suspect that the story was even more complex than the files suggested. The temporal resonance detector was showing patterns that didn't match the official timeline. There were echoes, repetitions, suggestions that certain events had been repeated or revised multiple times. He decided to take a risk. Using the access codes that Dr. Voss had provided, he began to search for the deepest files in the Kronos archive. What he found made his blood run cold. The files were labelled Ouroboros Protocol, and they contained evidence of something that should have been impossible. The project wasn't just suppressing evidence of time travel. They were engaging in time travel themselves. The files contained detailed logs of temporal operations, missions to specific points in history to make selective alterations. The operations were surgical, precise, designed to change single events without disrupting the larger flow of history. But the cumulative effect was devastating. The timeline had been edited so many times that it was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And at the centre of it all was John Titer. According to the Ouroboros files, he hadn't just travelled back in time once. He had made multiple trips, each time trying to prevent a different catastrophe, each time creating new problems that required additional interventions. The files suggested that Titer wasn't just a time traveller. He was trapped in a temporal loop, endlessly repeating the same mission, never quite achieving the results he was looking for. Each iteration of the loop created new timeline branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. But the most disturbing revelation was contained in the final file labelled Subject Profile, Titer, John, real name classified. The file contained biometric data, voice print analysis, and psychological profiles. But it was the photograph that made Silas's world collapse. The face looking back at him from the screen was older, more weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was his own face, aged by decades of impossible experience. John Titer was Silas Greer. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. His lifelong insomnia, his fascination with the original broadcast, his ability to access the Orpheus files. He wasn't investigating the Titer incident. He was the Titer incident. The temporal resonance detector in his pocket began to vibrate frantically. The readings were off the charts, suggesting a massive temporal event was about to occur. Around him, reality began to shimmer and distort, as if the fabric of time itself was coming apart. He understood now why the timeline was so unstable. His presence in the past was creating paradoxes, contradictions that the universe was struggling to resolve. Every time he learned more about his own future, he created new branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. The government agents who had been hunting him weren't trying to stop him from revealing the truth. They were trying to prevent him from completing the loop, from becoming the John Titer who would send that fax to Art Bell. But it was too late. The loop was already closing. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the weight of events that had already been set in motion. In that moment, he understood that he had never had a choice. He had been following a script that had been written decades ago, playing out a role that had been predetermined by the laws of causality itself. His last act was to upload everything he had discovered to a series of encrypted servers hidden in the deep corners of the internet. The files would survive, even if he didn't. Someone else would find them. Someone else would piece together the truth. He typed a final message, his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had written these same words countless times before. The 5100 was a tool. The broadcast was the ignition. I didn't travel time, I broke it. And now I see everything. The loop, was me. As he hit send, the world dissolved around him, reality collapsing into a single point of impossible light. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection in the computer screen, but it was different now. Older, wearier, bearing the weight of knowledge that no human mind should have to carry. John Titer was gone. Silas Greer was gone. But the loop continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere in the multiverse, a 10-year-old boy was lying in bed, listening to Art Bell read a fax from a time traveller who claimed to be from the year 2036. The message would always be the same, the warning would always be ignored, and the loop would always close. Time, it seemed, was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a circle, endlessly repeating, endlessly consuming itself. And at the centre of that circle, a voice called out across the years, desperate and urgent and forever unheard. Don't trust the timeline, it's being rewritten. In the end, that was all that remained. The echo of a voice that had been erased from history, the ghost of a man who had tried to change the past, and had only succeeded in ensuring that it would happen exactly as it always had. The Titer files would be discovered eventually, pieced together by someone else who couldn't sleep, someone else who heard voices in the static. The truth would surface, as it always did, but it would be dismissed as fiction, as fantasy, as the delusions of someone who had spent too long staring into the abyss of classified information. And somewhere in the darkness between one moment and the next, between one timeline and another, the loop would continue, eternal and inescapable, a temporal Ouroboros devouring its own tail. The listener had remembered. The listener had become the message, and the message would always be the same.